Hello, welcome to FX PhD. My name is Matt Leonard and this is class number 2 of Katana 101. So in this class we're going to try and spend the entire time going through a mini project, but we're going to need to just get a few things sorted as we go along. So this is Katana 1.1 version 1. I think they're up to version 5 at the moment, which I should have installed by next lesson. So you can see this is the standard layout. Hopefully if you've just installed Katana, yours is going to look pretty much like this. We're not going to really spend too much time messing around with the layout. There's a couple of things that I like to do which you may also find useful. The first thing is you have this tab over here on the bottom right called Viewer. This is your kind of 3D perspective view. I tend to like to have that in the middle. So I'm going to drag it by clicking on the Viewer tab, left mouse drag into this bottom section here on the left. If I just let it go with my mouse somewhere in the middle, I'm going to end up with adding another tab to this scene graph section already. However, if I move it to the right hand side of that section, you can see I now get this dividing line. When I now let go, it actually adds it in as a new panel. So that's one of the things I like to do, and I probably also come over to my monitor, which you can think of as your render view, and I drag my monitor down into this bottom right hand section. So now we have monitor here on the bottom, next to it is the viewer and then the scene graph next to that. Then we have your node graph at the top and then your parameters above that. All of this I tend to save, and you can go to the save layout section by just going to layouts, save current layout. You can say I've already done it under what I've called matte. Okay, so if I just load in matte, it's going to look pretty much identical. Apart from this just needs to be dragged down a little bit. Okay, so here's my standard layout. Okay, from here the next thing we want to do is load in the model that we're going to be using. So that is going to be an Alembic file which I've generated inside of Maya and just saved it out as an ABC file. So the way you can do this is two ways. You can either right click with your mouse in the node graph area here, and right at the top you've got Alembic, and then all your other tools are here, and the big list is where you show all of the 3D nodes or all of the 2D nodes, and you've got other bits and bobs there. So we're just going to go with Alembic in, and it immediately appears under my cursor, which I can then move to wherever I want and click to let go. If I just go ahead and delete that for a moment. The other way is also to press Tab, and then this gives you again a big list of all the commands, and you can just type the name you want. So AL, and then you get Alembic, and then again it's under my cursor until I click to let go. Now, having loaded this in, we actually haven't loaded the Alembic file. It hasn't given us an option to load the Alembic file yet. So I can do that by double clicking the node, and then over here in the parameters section, this is where I can control the actual node itself. So I want to go to ABC Asset, click on the down arrow on the far right hand side and go to Browse, and that then brings up this window that enables me to go and look for that file. So I know it's on my desktop under Katana 101, class 01, or rather class 02, and then geometry. And here is the robot file, which I'm going to just click and accept to load. Now, having done that, not a lot seems to have changed. What you may have noticed though is that the scene graph is now showing us this root. And it's the root which is now kind of the Alembic file that we've loaded. But still we're not seeing anything down here in our viewer, which you may have expected, because this clearly looks like somewhere where some wireframe or your model might appear. Now the reason why you're not seeing it is because this section of our scene graph is closed up. And if you remember last week, we said as you open up things in the scene graph, it basically populates Katana, and Katana shows you it in different ways, either as a bounding box or as the actual geometry itself. So as I begin to drill down into my model, so I open up the root and then I can see world. world shows me geometry, geometry shows me the scene graph generator, and then the scene graph generator shows me the model. And there it is in its bounding box stage. Now, what are these other things in the background, and how am I even rotating around all this? Well, let's deal with navigation first. It's slightly different in different areas of the interface. So up here in the node graph, the left mouse button enables you to click and drag the node itself, whereas the middle mouse button enables you to actually pan around, and the right mouse button enables you to bring up the menus. Okay, so left mouse button is click and select and move the node. Middle mouse button is to pan around in the node graph, though it's hard to tell the difference. And then right mouse button brings up the menu that we've talked about earlier. In the viewer, however, the left mouse button enables you to select an object, the middle mouse button enables you to pan, and the right mouse button enables you to zoom. If you want to orbit, you hold down the control button and use the left mouse button. So with the, not the control, apologies, with the Alt button, Alt and left mouse button orbits around. Now you can, if you're in that frame of mind, like I often am from Maya, keep the Alt button down, middle mouse button pans, and right mouse button zooms or tracks in and out. Now you don't need that Alt button clicked to track in and out. You can still use the right mouse button on its own, and you don't need the Alt button clicked to pan using the middle mouse button either. Also, you can use the wheel mouse if you want, but if you want to kind of orbit around, then you definitely need the Alt mouse button clicked, Alt and left mouse button clicked. Okay, so why do we not see whatever this model is? Why are we not seeing the robot? Well, the reason being is because the robot is still shut down, and there's lots of elements in here that we can go ahead and start opening up. So if I right click and say expand to assembly and components, it opens up the model to its full extent. And now you can see, if I just drag this over, all of the elements that I made inside of Maya are now all visible. And there is our robot. Now if we want to see the robot full screen, we simply tap the space bar and he becomes a full screen panel so you can see what's going on. Same thing with our cameras. The reason why we don't see those is because, if I just come back here and just move across, is because if we scoot down side camera, you can see, because I selected it here, it highlights bright white, and then it highlights or chooses it down here, so it's quick for me to see. Same as if I click the claw or hand of the robot, you can see now that I've got my left hand selected. Again, if I choose this eye, you can see now that I've got my right eye selected. So if I choose this box, it tells me it's the side view, and if I open that up, you can now see, if I press F in the view to navigate to it, that's kind of a camera-ish kind of thing. Okay, and again, if I want to come back to my robot, easiest way is select and literally press F on the keyboard just to frame back into it, and there's my robot. Okay, now at the moment this isn't going to render because we don't have any cameras, materials, lights, or even a renderer defined. So let's go on and do that next. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is come across and here in our node graph, tab and just type in camera, and we want camera create, and I'm just going to drop this down next to my Alembic node. Now we've already got, as you probably noticed, as we've talked about already, some cameras left over from Maya, and we could probably do with getting rid of those before we begin to make new cameras. So let's just do that first. So I'm just going to come into my Alembic node, and with that selected, I'm just going to tab and type the word prune, as in to cut away. So we're going to prune the cameras we don't want. Now, a couple of ways of connecting these together. I could literally just drop this down, come up here, click on the out, drag to the A input and let go. Just take that off. I could also click on the A input and drag up to the out, and that again connects it. Or with this selected, so I just click and hold down the left mouse button, drag up, and you can see the arrow that I'm heading towards goes yellow. Once it's yellow, it means it's connected. So if I now let go of the left mouse button, the node is then connected into that Alembic node above, and then I can literally just click again and drop it where I want. So we've now set the prune node, but we want to now define what we want to prune. So I'm going to come into the front, and I'm going to middle mouse drag once I have double clicked on prune, just to get it open over here. I can obviously just click on the green if I wanted to, but often you want to work down, so I find double clicking is easier. Middle mouse drag from the scene graph, the front view, drag it with the middle mouse button over to where it says add statement over here in the parameters section, and just drop it. And it adds the statement that it's going to prune this front view from this path here that it's getting from the Alembic file. So I'm going to come again and just grab the perspective view, middle drag over, and if I drag that on statement, it's simply going to switch the front view with the perspective view, which isn't what I want. I want to keep adding it. So I'm going to come over and I'm going to drop it into this section instead. And as I'm doing that, you're probably noticing that they're disappearing from here. And the reason why they're disappearing is because not only are we actually adjusting the prune by having the green box selected and therefore it open in the parameters section, but we're also viewing it at the scene graph and viewer position here, which is why as we're making updates, it's adjusting what we're viewing. If I was to have this selected to blue, you'll notice now that not only are the front and perspective still there, but as we begin to make changes, so if I take the side and drag it in and let go, they're not deleting now because we're viewing up here, and we're therefore viewing not at the point in which we're pruning, but up the point above. So it's pretty standard hierarchy kind of methodology. So again, the top view in, and now we've pruned the perspective, front, side and top. If I now come to here and literally just click on the blue, you'll notice that all those have disappeared, and in our viewer they have also gone. So now we've got a clean slate ready to start using the camera. So let's come to create camera. I'm again going to just click on the green box here, and you can see we have lots of information about our camera. It's a perspective camera, its field of view is 70mm. I'm going to take a 50mm lens because I think that's going to look a little bit nicer. Everything else I'm going to pretty much leave as is. Now, I now want to connect that camera into the rest of our scene. So I'm going to use a merge node to do that. So I'm going to go with a merge. I'm going to drop the merge under the camera. I'm going to take the camera, drag it down to the merge and let go. And that's gone into input 0. Then I'm going to take the prune and drag that into, you can see we now have two options. I can either drag it into the box that appears there. That will replace input 0 with this one, like so. And again, back into the box replaces. Or I can make a new input simply by dragging into this kind of little box here. So now that I have two inputs, input O and input 1, or 0 and 1. Okay, so I'm going to just leave it like that. If you want to go directly into one of the existing ones, you can just drag it like so. Okay, so pretty straightforward as you would expect. Now, if I was to view this merge node at this point, you can see that down here I now have a camera, and if I open my camera, you can see the camera has appeared at the middle of world space, which is where all these things get put. So how do I look through the camera? Well, I can either come to perspective and choose camera here, and now I'm looking through the camera. Let's go back to perspective, or I can take my camera, middle drag it into the viewer and let it go. Actually grab the camera itself into the middle view, and then I can actually now navigate around like you would in Maya. So again, I'm just holding down Control. So again, I'm just holding down Alt and just dragging with the left, middle and right mouse buttons just until I get this where I want it. So now we have our camera in position all lined up. This green box represents what's actually going to be rendered. Okay, so anything outside the green box isn't going to get rendered, and it's square because by default Katana is giving us a 512 by 512 output. Okay, so that is what we're getting. So let's now go ahead and make some materials, because that's another thing we're going to need. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to come down, and what I want to do is create a material or material stack, and I'm going to go with just a material node. Now the difference between a material and a material stack is whether you want to create one texture or shader, one material, or multiple, and I'm just going to create one for the time being. So here it is. I'm going to feed it into my merge node, and it goes. And on my material, if I double click on it, you can see that I have the name of the material. So I'm going to call this red metal. The type of material is, it's going to create a new one, and I'm going to add a shader, and I'm going to say that the shader I'm going to use is going to be an Arnold surface shader. Then I come down to here, and on the Arnold surface shader, it's now going to give me an option as to what type of shader I want. So I'm going to go with a standard shader. So I'm going to choose standard, and now it has all of the parameters for that shader. So if I press space, you can see it goes full screen, and now I can get to all of the parameters for that standard Arnold surface shader. So you've got things like the diffuse color, the specular, reflection, etc., etc. Okay, and all of these KD, KS, KM, KSN, I'll be giving you a list of all those, what they mean a bit later on in the term. Okay, for the time being, all we need to know is this is going to make us a white diffuse material with no specular highlight on it, and if it did have a specular highlight, which it doesn't, it would be white as well. So let's just assign that to the robot, and then we'll tweak it. So we'll come back here, and we will go ahead and we'll now assign that straight to the robot that we have. So I'm going to go now with a material assign, and that's going to be clicked and added under the merge. Double click on it just so that it's loaded both in the scene graph at that point, so we see the robot again, and it's also assigned and opened in the parameters panel. So what I want to do is I want to say take my robot, middle drag up to the add statement, and that's going to say the robot is now being assigned as a statement to the material assign node. It then wants to know, well, what material do I want to assign to the robot? Well, that's easy. I come down to the bottom, and at the very bottom here I have my materials, and I have my red material that I created. So I'm going to middle drag the red material into the material assign slot. Now we have the red material assigned to the robot. Now we're not done yet. We have to now define what the actual renderer is we're going to use, because at the moment we have no renderer. So let's do that next. So I'm going to first of all say that I want to add some Arnold global settings. So I'm going to grab those and add those underneath, and let's drop those down a fair way. And again, if I double click on that, this really defines things like the anti-aliasing and various other things to do with the actual renderer or itself being Arnold. I then want to define the output size of my render. So again, I'm going to go with a render settings. So this defines things like how big the renderer is going to be. So double click on this again, having connected it, and you can see by default it's going to give us a resolution of 512 by 512, but it thinks it's going to go with RenderMan. We're going to say not this time. The final thing we want to do is actually create the renderer itself. So we're going to tab again and choose renderer, and that's going to go under here at the very bottom. And the renderer simply defines things like the outputs, etc. So now if I right click and say interactive renderer, we get a nice black screen. Now why are we getting a black screen? Well, if I press A in here, you can see we actually do have the robot, but we're not seeing anything because we have created no lights at the moment. So let's do that, and then let's come in and start tweaking some of this information. So the way that we create lights inside of Katana is through the gaffer node. So I'm going to tab and type gaffer, and I'm going to bring the gaffer in, and I tend to keep it to the side and merge it in, or you could just drop it straight in here if you wanted to. Let's just throw it in there for the time being. Now the gaffer node is where you create all of your lights. So if I open up the gaffer node in the parameters section by clicking on the green dot here, the green square, first thing I'm going to do is say what kind of lights do I want to make. Well, obviously I want Arnold lights. I think RenderMan lights will be too useful with the Arnold renderer. I'm then going to come in here and I'm going to say what type of light do I want to use. Well, I'm going to go with just a normal light itself. I could add a HDRI sky dome, but I'm going to go with just a standard light. And you can see immediately it's thrown open the material information for the light. So the radius of the light, materials here. So I'm going to need to add a shader. So let's just go with a light shader. And then in here, I can choose what type of light I want. So let's go with a spotlight. So up here now you can see it's telling me that I've made one light and it's a spotlight. So I'm going to call this light key light. And I'm going to navigate around here in the perspective panel. And you can see that down at his feet is the spotlight. So how do I look through the spotlight? Well, I can either click here and choose spotlight, or the same as the camera, I can take the spotlight, which happens to be right at the bottom, middle drag it in, and then I'm looking through it again. So let's spin round and get us to somewhere here. It's looking okay. Click down here again and back to perspective. And if I zoom out, you can see there's my spotlight. Now I've got some interactive controls which are really nice. So I can go to manipulator and go to cone angle, and I've got the ability to adjust both the penumbra and the cone angle itself. So you can see that's looking pretty good. We could also adjust things like the radius and other bits and pieces, but I'm just going to go with the manipulator off at the moment. Also in this display we can do things like switch on shadows and lighting, etc. But I'm going to just leave it as standard for the time being. I'm then going to come in and I'm going to add a second light. So this will be our fill light. So I'm going to click, add another light. This time I'm going to just double click here and I'm going to go with just a point light. And this light I'm going to say is my fill light. And you can see again it's arrived down at the bottom. So if you want, you can now use some interactive keys. So you can see if I press W on the keyboard, I get my move controls or translate. E gives me rotate, R gives me scale. And the scale doesn't come up because you can't scale a light. T changes the background to black, which I'm just going to change back. Grey, there we go. So I'm going to go back to my W hotkey, move this out and up And let's just move it out over here somewhere. And we'll see how that looks in a moment. So now back to our render, right click, interactive, re-render, render. And this will now keep it rendering. Now, I don't know whether you can see it, but I can see a very faint outline to my robot there. The reason why I'm not seeing it too brightly is the fact that these values are very low. So let's go to the key light. Let's scroll down and you can see that we have intensity of 1, but the exposure is set to 0. So let's begin to increase that. So I'm going to go with an exposure of say 5. You can see that's definitely now adding a bit of brightness. Let's try say 10. Much better, maybe a little bit too bright, but 8 might be the lucky one. Let's go for 8. And then scroll back up to the top and choose our point light. And here, instead of adjusting it down here, I can literally double click in this value and just choose what I want for that. So I'm going to go with, say, a value of 10 for that. That seems to be quite nice. Okay. Now, if we went back to our key light, remember one of the options was radius, so I can increase that to say 1. You can see now we're getting smoother shadows. We're getting some noise in our shadows, but we're getting some now slightly smoother shadows. And there's various other controls in here, such as samples. So make that 32. So that's going to add some additional samples in for our light. And that's way too much. So I'm going to go with just say 2. Because in Arnold, these values are timed up by the main anti-aliasing settings. So you don't want to be cranking these up too high, unlike other renderers where you need to because of the way the maths work. Okay, so from here, let's go and get the overall robot quality a bit higher. So we'll go to the Arnold global settings, and the anti-aliasing overall is 1, so let's make that 2. And now we're going to see a good increase in quality. So now I do need to refresh this, and I can do that either by coming back to the renderer and right clicking and going interactive render again, or I can just use the hotkey slash down by the Z key. And now you can see we're getting a much nicer, smoother image. Okay, so let's do a couple of extra things before we're out of time. Let's add something under his feet, so he stood on something, and let's give him a couple of red eyes. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make just a standard primitive object. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to come to source, and I'm going to come to primitive create, and I'm going to drop this in here, and then I'm going to go to merge, and I'm going to merge my primitive create with my alembic after the prune. Okay, down we go, and then I'm going to merge that merge with this merge, and all that I can budge up a little bit. Now if I just focus on this part, you can see at the moment the primitive create has actually made a sphere, which isn't a bad shape, my favorite, but I want just a straightforward kind of planar shape. So let's go with a plane, and I want the plane obviously to be quite a lot bigger, so let's go with say 25 by 25. So there's the plane now under his feet. Now if I come back to the material assign, we only assign the material to the red to the robot. So we want to come back to our list here, and here's our primitive. It's a NURBS patch at the moment, and we're going to add that primitive into our list here. So now we've assigned that. Let's come back to our primitive here. We've got our plane. I don't think we want to change anything else for the time being, and let's just do a re-render of that. Slash again, And now you can see the robot on the floor, which probably could do with being a little bit bigger. So let's maybe go with 100 by 100. And again, right down to the bottom, double click so everything's open. Let's just line up our camera. So again, scroll down to your camera, middle drag in, and maybe just go with slightly better view, maybe there. And again, right click, interactive renderer, and now we can see everything that we've got in the scene. Now, next thing we promised to do is make the eyes a different color. So we're going to do that by making another material. So I'm going to tab, type material again. This time, this material I'm going to call red eyes. And I'm going to create, again, a new material, add a shader. It's going to be an Arnold shader. Here, again, I'm going to come in and just make a standard shader. And the standard shader is going to be, once we open it, we're going to go with a diffuse color of red. So diffuse here, click, let's go with a nice red, full red, they can all be down. So that's looking nice. We'll say OK. We want the diffuse value to be all the way up to 1, so we get a nice bright red. Not too bothered about having specular information, but let's just have maybe a little bit, 0.2, and we'll just keep it as a white highlight and make it a sharper highlight, so maybe a Fong style. Okay, specular roughness I'm going to bring down just a little bit, 2.5. Now what's a shame is there's no kind of mirror, there's no kind of ball or swatch that you can see, so you really have to kind of guess your way through and then assign it and hope once you've assigned it you're roughly in the ballpark, and then you tweak once it's in the interactive renderer. So I'm going to merge my two materials together. You don't need to, but I like to do it. Merge, merge, and then this goes back into our main merge here. We've then got this material as assign, which at the moment, if we remember, is assigning it directly to the robot. Now, the robot is really kind of the top level, so that's assigning it to everything. Let's see what happens if we now make another material assign underneath this and tell it to do something else. So this time, second material assign. This material assign, I'm going to say just to the eyes. So I'm going to grab one eye, shift select the other, middle drag those, which you can't. So instead, you go F in here to highlight them, then middle drag into here, which is the add statement. That's where we're adding the model. And then down here, I'm going to go red eyes and drop those into the material assign. Now let's re-render this. And you can see because the second material assign is below the robot, although the eyes at this point are being assigned the white, the next one down assigns them the red. So we're actually assigning the material twice, which isn't probably the best thing to do, but it does work. And we'll look at other ways in which we can do that, work with that later, or at least in another class. So there is our robot. It has red eyes, it has nice shadows. Anti-aliasing all doesn't look too bad. Let's go full screen on this. So I'm just going to press the plus button, F to frame, and again just do a render by, first of all, let's just choose homing the view, moving it to the middle, and then re-render again with just the slash button. Now if we're not happy with the quality of the anti-aliasing, we can up that, but I think for the time being that isn't a bad first lesson, so I'm going to leave it there for today. The information has been saved to your temp folder, so if I just go back to this view and we go down to the renderer here, the output is being saved to this temp folder if you want to get hold of it and do anything with it, but I think that's going to be fine for the time being. So I'm going to come into File, Save As. I'm going to call this kat102, accept, and we are finished. So any questions? There's probably a lot. Remember, this is only slightly skimming the surface. Next week, more detail, more fun. So look forward to chatting with you on the forums. And until next week, this has been Matt Leonard for FX PhD.